Hi listeners, I'm Izzy, my pronouns are they and them. Welcome to the Critical Conversations for Social Work podcast. This is Joella.
Before we start, we'd like to acknowledge the country that we're recording this episode on today and pay our respects to the Turrbal and Yagara peoples and their elders, past, present and emerging, by committing to always remembering that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
This podcast explores critical and creative pedagogies used in social work practice and education. Critical and creative pedagogies position social justice at the forefront of social work and human services and work creatively towards social and emancipatory change. So we're going to have a little bit of a chat about the vision for this project. Jean?
Thank you, Izzy. I'm going to talk about the vision. And so my name's Jean Carruthers. My pronouns are she, her. I am the educator in the group and work with an amazing crew of students who are doing this as part of their placement. And so the things that I wanted to talk about are how the podcast emerged. So how it emerged, there's kind of two stories in this. It was two synchronistic things that happened. One of them was the publication of the Routledge book of Critical Pedagogies for Social Work, which was published by Morley, Phillip, Ablett, Carolyn and Stephen Cowden. I was part of that book. I have a chapter in that book, and what it made me think about is the ways that all of these amazing critical and creative pedagogies are out there and how we could make them more accessible to students and practitioners in social work and human services. So in relation to that, this also coincided with me finishing my PhD, which looked at using performance as a form of critical pedagogy in social work. And it just seemed sort of natural for this to be part of that process. I love podcasts myself. I do feel like this is a platform that I would be comfortable to share information and knowledge on. The other thing that was part of that is that we had students who were trying to find placements, and within the climate of COVID-19, it was becoming really, really difficult for that to happen. And so our university, where I work at QUT, had decided that we would have research projects that people could do. And this became a podcast project that we did. And so as part of what was called the Centre for Social Change, which was developed to help support students who needed to be going on placement, but placements weren't available for them, they were able to do these projects to be able to gain knowledge and experience that was relevant to practice in social work and human services. And this was one of them. And some of the knowledge that this recognises is the ways that they could develop critical praxis, which is thinking critically about linking theory and practice, effective listening and communication. One of the big parts of this project was collaboration, recognising diversity, inclusivity and relevance to the current climate and context associated with social work and human services. It's been a very slow and deliberate process. This is the second iteration of students that have come through, so it's taken a year to get to here. And we're at the stage where we're developing our first Part A and Part B series of episodes as a pilot for this project, I guess you could say, as part of the Centre for Social Change. But I'm going to pass on to Morley so he can tell you a little bit more about the Part A and Part B aspect of this particular podcast. Thanks, Morley.
So how we're planning on releasing the episodes loosely is coming out, I think, once a fortnight, and it'll be dropped in a Part A and a Part B section. The Part A section was with the last group students who were on placement, and they were interviewing people who use critical and creative pedagogies in their work.
Mm-hmm.
It was sort of like 4 or 5 set questions. What's your interpretation of critical pedagogy? How's it relevant to your work, and sort of how did you come to incorporate that in your framework? And then we have the Part B episodes, which are a response to that, and sort of in the ilk of critical pedagogy, kind of really try to break down those themes and terms. A bit more of an informal conversation between someone who's interested in the field, but not necessarily a professional, and then with Jean. But Jean doesn't really dictate that conversation, sort of it just kind of goes where the person wants it to go.
Absolutely. So it kind of flows, and sometimes we had conversations where 2 people were involved, and that might be a student or a former student, someone who practices in social work and human services. And it was really valuable to have that diversity in the conversations that we were having. I think we could pass on and talk a little bit more about the vision.
Yeah, and some of the values. Something that the first group of students who worked on this project, they discussed what the values governing this project would be, and what they identified as values were things like critical thinking and reflection. So that passion about providing alternative perspectives to social work practice through creative and critical pedagogy.
Yeah.
Around accessibility for the podcast. So particularly accessibility around to the hearing impaired and deaf community, and also around accessibility generally. So this is an openly accessible format. The other was around diversity and inclusivity. So valuing people, including the cultural, gender and educational backgrounds they come from, and the knowledges they bring that are often marginalised through other disciplines. And there was also an emphasis on applicable content. So the idea that the content would be accessible and applicable for practice for social work practitioners and other people interested in the field. And probably most significantly, there's also a value there around social justice and around the platform being a place for us to advocate for critical and creative pedagogies.
Yeah. And in that process, it was really important that we weren't just expecting other people to deliver that we actually did that as well as part of the process. Did you guys want to talk about some of the ways that critical and creative pedagogy was part of your experience? These values, I guess, was part of your experience of doing this project.
I know from my particular perspective, or I'd say, I don't know what other people's experience of it has been, but throughout there's been a very deliberate process of discussion around the elements that go into the podcast, who speaks, when they speak, what views are represented. That's actually been a very deliberate process that has been collaboratively determined. So there's an aspect of group voice rather than individual top-down decision-making, which is very much a part of critical pedagogy.
So when you say who speaks and when they speak, we don't just tell students, no, you can't speak right now or anything like that.
Yeah.
It's more about ensuring that, and that's about power, isn't it? So ensuring that I'm very much conscious of being the educator and having power in this situation and having power in this group. However, we deliberately didn't have me being the person to speak first in this episode, so that it wasn't that this is something that an educator is doing and students are involved, but they don't have decision-making power in this, because it absolutely wasn't that case. And we were as equal as we can possibly be in this process when I'm an educator and I'm working with students. And that was a real foundation of the way we work together, wasn't it? Yeah. Thanks, Hayley. Was there other people wanted to add to that?
I'm happy to jump in here, talk about the accessibility that Hayley mentioned. All the episodes of the podcast will have transcripts created and released alongside them, as I myself struggle with hearing on podcasts, particularly new big words. And so that was also part of the research group as well, to release definitions alongside a transcript so everyone has access to the knowledge. And that was a part of the critical pedagogy for me throughout the whole thing, was bringing these big academic words down to like normal level, which I really loved how we use students in the discussion, because I feel that not that we as students are at the bottom, but we have maybe the least lived experience to know what someone's talking about. And so, yeah, we're not afraid in these episodes to ask, what do you mean by that definition? What is it that underpins it for you? How do you view yourself within that? And so, yeah, so also with the collaboration aspect, of course, it was so much. And I collaborated with Mel in the media group alongside the transcripts. Any video or like audio released on social media, we're aiming to have subtitles included in that as well. So it's not, distancing some people more than others, and that everyone can follow along and know what is actually being said and not misconstruing by accident.
So that accessibility was always a really clear intention, that we wanted these words to be accessible, and sometimes that was really hard. Sometimes it was that there were so many big words, because critical pedagogy, there are a lot of big words, and there's so many, it was really hard to break them all down in one episode. And we all worked as a team and did like a pre-interview with the person that we were having the discussion with to make sure that all our voices were part of that, even though it was only me and another person that was having the discussion. It was a collective venture to actually get to the stage where we did those Part B episodes, which was really great.
Yeah, and I think that was really evident. Sort of in those Part Bs, you often reference, I've got this from the group, or you'd be turning to the research group to get a definition for a bunch of words, or because, there is that many terms in critical pedagogy that can leave you befuzzled.
That's a good word.
And
Do we need to break that down?
Those pre-interviews which led into the Part Bs were definitely a big part of it. So we would meet with the person who was going to talk with Jean, and we'd talk for an hour at least or more about what's your interpretation of it, but also the group's also been researching, listening to it, so they want to give you their interpretation of it, make with it what you will, but we want to make sure that everyone's involved in it, and just getting that sort of, we've all got our own worldviews, diverse opinions, and making sure everyone's getting a say with it. So I thought those pre-interviews were really helpful.
Yeah. And really inclusive. Everyone had a voice in that. It was really important.
Yeah, I found that there were often things that came up in the pre-interviews that I definitely wouldn't have thought of myself. And so it was really beneficial, I think, to have everyone's perspectives coming to those, because it just gave us so much diversity in the perspectives we were getting.
Did you want to add anything else to that, Izzy, in relation to the inclusivity and the diversity? Anything?
No, I don't think so. I think that it was just all the way along we tried to intentionally be as inclusive as possible and make sure that we were kind of centering marginalised voices and disrupting some of those typical notions of power.
Yeah. And being mindful of how we actually used language and how we brought those conversations so that we were not reinforcing mainstream ideas or reinforcing sort of top-down ideas, constructions. We didn't want to be neoliberal in any way, shape or form. And we didn't want to be hegemonic. Like when we talk about hegemony and we're talking about the ways that those people in power have all the decision-making and everybody else just sort of conforms to that way of thinking. We didn't want to have that top-down approach. And so really being mindful of the ways that we recognised diversity and for people who are especially marginalised in social work and human services. So
I think it was one of the good things that disrupted some of that kind of power notion, especially when it came to you being the educator, was that so I was the last person to join the team, and when I joined it wasn't Jean that gave me the introduction, rather it was Mel and then the rest of the group who kind of introduced me to the project and everything like that, as opposed to that sort of traditional approach where the educator would step in and inform me of everything I needed to know. It was a much more kind of group directed process.
Yeah. So that brings us kind of to that collaboration. Did you want to say something, Joella?
Not really. I think Hayley did a really good job at describing our collaboration a little bit earlier, and what you were saying about sharing the decision-making power. I think that was something that has really stood out to me. Like that was very evident in all of the decisions we made, all the discussions that we had, like even in our subgroups, we would discuss things and then we'd bring it to the entire group, and people who weren't technically in that subgroup could still share their voice and weigh in on decisions that we were making, which for me was a different experience to other experiences I've had in other workplaces. So I think that was really cool and important.
And if anyone was sort of wondering what subgroups was, in the first few weeks, I think a few of us were kind of wondering, where are we going with this? And then Jean encouraged us to split up into subgroups. So you'd join a few different groups and then you would lead a group, which had it was nice also to have that experience of holding space and doing leadership. But in that way, it kind of took the power off Jean and then created a sort of codependency in the groups where we could work together with each other on tasks. Does anyone want to talk to how they liked the subgroups?
I guess speaking to the liaison group work, that was probably one of, from my perspective, one of the most interesting to see how collaboration worked. So, for example, it included the group coming up with all kinds of frameworks. So ethical frameworks around how we'd engage with people using those social justice and critical pedagogical principles.
And that you're talking about the guests that we had.
Yeah.
The students and practitioners and educators that were part of the interviews. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. That process was very much collaborative. And the strength of that, which is, I think, one of the strengths of a lot of most critical pedagogical work, is that knowledge is, for want of a better word, it's crowdsourced. It doesn't represent the views of an individual person, and therefore it doesn't have the weakness that an individual contribution has. It's the sum of all of those strengths of the group.
Wonderful. Thank you.
The liaison group, sorry, because I didn't know what liaison was before we started the group, is the group that was contacting everyone. So Haley was emailing potential guests or people to participate. And I think one of the big reflections that Haley was making sure was that we had sort of an established consent form and sorted out things such as confidentiality. Did anyone want to talk to sort of some of the work and considerations that we had for that group? Ethics
was a big thing. We had a lot of conversations about it, didn't we? So we really considered the ethical implications, the ways that people wanted to be addressed, like whether they just used their first name, whether they used a pseudonym, or whether they were happy to have their full name on the podcast. What were some of the other ethical considerations that
we had an optional form so people could include their pronouns if they felt safe or comfortable to do so.
Yeah.
I think there was a lot of work going into sort of just painting out what the project was, the vision behind it, so somebody wasn't sort of thrown into it not understanding what it was, and making sure that, they felt comfortable participating.
Yeah. So being really transparent in the process to make sure that the guests felt like they could opt out as well if they wanted to as well. What about other subgroups?
For the media, we tried to make sure it was accessible as possible, and in terms of collaboration as well, we had very mindful discussions to make sure we were constantly upholding the values of this podcast. For example, like Juliet was stating before, we had transcripts on all the podcasts as well as the Instagram posts to make sure that people who were hard of hearing were able to still listen to our podcast and to understand what's going on. Also, in terms of accessibility, we wanted to have diversity at the forefront of our values. So we were very considerate when we were discussing the colours, transcript, language. Yes, everything was very thoughtful and mindful.
Yeah, lots of discussion around just the smallest little things, and really important things as well, to recognise who would be excluded if we did things in a particular way, and making sure that it wasn't about being equal, like everybody being equal. It's about recognising equity within that process and recognising inclusivity and the diversity, but having thoughtful conversations around the ethics behind those things all of the time. And that was in all of the groups. So whether it was to do with media, tech, liaison, research, funding, and we haven't really talked about the tech side of things. And that was another process that was really ethically thought about.
That was a bit of a process that I didn't expect. So we, as a group, went through for, I feel like it was over a month, anyone can correct me on that, looking for transcript software that wouldn't charge us. Not only because we're small funding, but we didn't feel it was right to pay for something we thought everyone should have access to. So after quite a bit of research into that, we did find one. And yeah, it does take a bit more time maybe than others, but we're happy to counteract that within our hours. Recording side of it, you'll probably hear the difference in sound from part A's to part B's, as part A's were recorded, as Jean said, during COVID, and so a lot of Zoom conversations. And we didn't like that Zoom would cut off someone if you were just going, I agree. And so we worked really hard in figuring out a different way.
And what the opportunity came up because of having conversations about the podcast, that we didn't even know that there was a recording studio at our university that we could have access to for these kinds of things. And so the beauty of this is we're all in this amazing room, and the staff here are absolutely incredible in providing that accessibility to us so that we can do this. And because we don't have a budget, we're doing it for free. And I think the students have really worked hard in finding ways to be able to make this accessible and make this podcast happen without a budget, which is, it's huge.
And just acquiring the knowledge, like I know that Julia had a bit of experience recording and Izzy a bit of experience editing, but really a lot of this was sort of learning on the fly. So it's definitely a process that'll be improved across the semesters. And we've already built on what we've learnt from the first group and trying to keep it sustainable. We'll put everything in that we've learnt into documents to make sure the next group can take that and run, and I'm sure they'll make it even better.
Yeah. Also with that, like the tech stuff, trying to do something that will be sustainable as well. Yes. So when it comes to like the software that we're using for editing, having something that we can use now that also the next group will be able to use as well. So finding something that's not only free but also runs on different operating systems and is easy to learn to use. And so many, I think, complications that we didn't expect, and led to us having to make some really important decisions around how do we make it so that we can hand this off to another group and the project can be really sustainable.
Another accessibility thing within the recording is that the studio is 24/7, and as we are online students, we can sort of work around the guest's work schedule, which I really like, that it's not like, oh, sorry, you can't make it by 4, we can't listen to your voice. It was very much like the pre-interview on Zoom. I think there was one at 6 p.m. one night for an hour or so. And then, the recordings are whenever we can get them in, because it is hard to get into campus sometimes if you're busy working and traffic.
Such a gift.
And the sustainability, we're kind of talking around a lot of Joella's area in the group of funding. And so what were some of the considerations that we had for funding and trying to make the podcast sustainable?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that although we've talked about having little to no budget, we did have a funding group that was researching funding options, but by applying a critical pedagogy lens, we were only interested in choosing options for funding that served our values rather than more neoliberal values. And an example of that, I suppose, is when we found a potential funding grant that we could apply for, but we decided not to after having a really good discussion around things like the name of the grant or how that grant might have come to secure that money. And if that didn't kind of align with our values, then we weren't interested. So I think that was really important to us to critically reflect and choose funding options that were driven by our values rather than driven by the need for funding to get the podcast going.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that was about remaining with the ethos of the values of social work and human services and the values of critical and creative pedagogy and ensuring that we're not reinforcing those hegemonic ideas through the ways and affiliating with things that sit with those values really
exactly.
well. Yeah, that was really important. A few people might be sort of thinking that how does this have anything to do with social work and human services placement, but I would say that and I'll hand over to you guys in relation to having a placement where you're learning about social work and human service practice. What have you gained from this for yourselves?
I guess what you're talking to, a lot of what I'm getting from this is it wasn't so much, it is nice that we're doing it and creating the podcast and it'll be a great resource, but it's as much about the process of creating it. There's so many things like the funding. It's we went so far down that, that direction, and we could have gone, we've already put the effort in, let's just secure the funding. But it's like, no, it's more about creating the podcast in a way that is critically pedagogical. So no, we're not going to do that. So a lot of the times this feels like sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, but it ended up working out in a way that we've pretty much managed to get it off the ground for free, and we've managed to stay true to the values.
I feel like we've been as resourceful as possible in these situations without funding and utilising everyone's skills and talents as well, which is something that comes back to collaboration.
And another thing with the collaboration that was a learning curve for me is I'm very used to managerialism, like you have a week, come back with an answer. And so as Joella mentioned before about the subgroups, we might come to the big group with an idea and someone may say, why, or I don't fully agree, and we go away for 2 weeks and discuss it more in depth, consider all options or viewpoints that they've presented to us, and we might come back with the same answer or the same option, but we have ethical supporting it now. It's not just, that was just the easiest, and we thought there was a lot of the consideration in it.
Yeah. And looking at all the possibilities. And so rather than just thinking, this is the only way to do things, we looked at, well, what are some of the other ways that we could do it? Because not everyone's sort of agreeing with this particular way. How could we do it where we do all have a say in what that might look like? And sort of expanding our critical understanding, critical reflection, critical knowledge about what are the possibilities that are here that we haven't considered yet.
And I think that when it comes to sort of relating things back to how does this help us as social work practitioners and how this sort of how we've learnt from this placement, being able to take a step back and consider all the options and maybe think outside the box a bit is such a useful and important thing to be able to do in our practice, that having gotten to practice it so much on placement, I think will benefit all of us hugely.
I think adding on that, critical pedagogy matters for social work practice because as it's concerned, it quite often looks at the experiences of oppressed people and people who don't have the power, and it finds ways to work with them around the knowledges they have. And that's really central to what we do as social workers, to working alongside people and being able to use what they know and how they know to inform how we work with them.
And the way, thank you, Hayley, that was well said. And the way that we share this with our community, our social work and human services community through the podcast, is that we are sharing critical pedagogy and creative ways to think critically about social work practice and education through this educational platform. And so we're doing critical and creative pedagogy by using a creative process to share education and to make that knowledge accessible, so that we can think more critically about the ways that we do social work and human services into the future. So let's sort of wind it up now, and I might pass over to Mel, who's just going to give you some further information for how you could get involved in this podcast and where to from here.
Thank you, Jean, and thank you for everyone for listening to today's episode. If you'd like to keep up with any of our socials and to continue listening to future episodes, please follow us on Instagram. That's Critical Conversations, 4 SW. That's a bit of a mouthful, but yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See ya.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.